Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Leibowitz. We today have a very nice treat with us. We have on a woman who is a retired detective. She worked on the force for 20 years, and she's going to talk to us today about her experiences, and I think it's going to be great. Alison Sullivan, welcome to the show.
Hey, Mike, thank you for having me.
So the obvious first question is, what in God's name compelled you to become a cop, and when did you make that decision?
That's a common question. So I didn't start out young wanting to be a cop. I actually was aiming to be a prosecutor. And from a young age, I just had a drive, a passion for justice. Some reasons for that, some early experiences of seeing some people close to me use drugs, and just the terrible things that did to them was really impactful for me. Having someone very close to me sexually assaulted, and learning about how that happened and how it impacted them, and just some early experiences of violent grandfather, some other people, those things shaped and impacted me in ways that really, I can't remember, 5, 8, 10, but I know my teen years, it was a big driver, my passion for justice and caring a lot about that. So I actually was gunning to be an attorney, and unfortunately, a family tragedy that we experienced. My mom drowned, and she and I were very, very tight, and that just kind of sidelined me. I had been accepted to Rutgers Law School, and at the time, I just needed some space and some time off. And so this volunteer organization that I was affiliated with as an undergrad invited me to take a year off to work with them. And, life events change the course of what you think you're going to do and what your plans are and what you hope to do. And anyway, I ended up working for that nonprofit for almost 7 years. And I saw some wild stuff. We brought teams of college students into Mexico, Guatemala, Belize. I saw some incredible things. But if you've ever worked for a nonprofit or know much about it, there's you're not making a killing exactly. And it just wasn't where my heart was at. And at that point, I wanted to return to my original passion, but financially, I wasn't in a place to pay for law school at that point. So I'd gotten real out of shape. So I thought, you know what, let me try this cop thing, get my chunky self back in shape, and see if I can make a go of it and make a little bit of money. And if I like it, I'll stick with it. If I don't, I'll use that as a segue, as a stepping stone to pursue law school.
So I have a very good friend of mine who was a prosecutor in San Diego for 18 or 19 years. And he talks about how from a very young age, he always had a keen sense of justice. And it sounds like you had the same experience, where you always just had a keen sense of right and wrong, and that justice should be done. And you initially wanted to be a prosecutor, and then ended up, becoming a police officer, detective. Do you have any regrets in that things didn't turn out differently so you could be a prosecutor? In other words, was your sense of justice satisfied by your 20 years on the force?
I wouldn't say it's completely satisfied, which is why I've initiated the business I have now after having retired, but we'll get to that later. But police work can be really satisfying, and particularly in a small agency like the one that I worked for, when you've only got a staff of around 50-ish, you are doing the work every day. So you don't have to wait to become a detective to be involved in significant investigations on a week-to-week basis in an agency that's that small, but borders a larger city like Hartford. So, yeah, I mean, I would describe law enforcement comparatively as riveting, exasperating, exciting, really challenging at times. But yeah, I would say it scratched that itch in a major way.
Now, despite you referring to yourself as your former chunky self or whatever you said, you're a woman and you're relatively tiny. You're not even a big, for a woman. And police work is dangerous. I just wonder, how did your family and friends react when you tell them you're going to become a cop?
Yeah, well, anyone that knows me well knows that really when I decide to do something, that's what's happening. So if there was some negative, I didn't really get much of it because probably because of my personality, for good and for bad. So mostly people were supportive. I'm probably concerned. I would say no one in my family's in law enforcement. No one's that crazy. But most people were supportive. They probably had no idea actually how dangerous it gets on it at times. Probably no idea. I don't think the average civilian does.
Even in working in a suburb, you would say it's dangerous?
Oh, God, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Because unless you're reading the police blotter, you know what I mean? It's like you don't think of it when you're in a suburb that there's all these crimes. Now, as somebody who committed an abundance of crimes in a suburb, I know that this type of stuff is happening. But most people, I think, are just unaware. But from when I talked to you, there were things that you told me about that occurred that I would never have thought occurred in town.
Right. So I think one of the disconnects is you mentioned a police blotter. From police blotters to local news, I would say 90% of what occurs does not get reported. So you can actually go to your local police department and request that. Well, I believe as of the time that I retired, this was still illegal. You can request the arrest log and see the arrests that have happened. So on a really slow night, Fox 61 or TNH might come by our station and ask to see the arrest log. But Hartford took most of the news, but most things don't even make it that far. Most things don't even make the news. I can remember one period in particular in my town where we had 3 shooting incidents in a matter of 2 weeks, and none of that was on the news. None of it. So what actually happens and then what gets reported and what people become aware of are 2 very, very different things.
So how old were you when you went into the academy? That's what it's called, right? The
29.
Academy.
Yeah.
So you're 29. How long is training and what was your training like?
Well, at that point, so I went in 2002. And at that point, it was about 5 months, just under 6 months, I believe. Now they've added to it. Now it's longer. It might be 6 or 7 months. But you live there. You live there the whole time. And it is like a paramilitary setting. You are municipal officers go to Post Academy in Meriden as well as state police, but the classes are separate. So my academy class was 48 of us started, and those were all officers hired by individual towns and then sent to the academy for training. And then you just get thrown together like what was that MTV show in the 90s?
I don't know, but Big Brother is what I'm thinking of.
Where basically there's videos on like a house that runs with like just a hodgepodge collection of people who may or may not like each other, and there's fights and they make up and then there's challenges. And I mean, it was, but it was wild, definitely challenging. A lot of academics, nights free to work out or get your classwork done. Some of the classes were incredible. Some of them were monotonous. Like the history of fingerprinting wasn't exactly riveting. I distinctly remember, why are we Why are we being subjected to this?
They have a class on that?
Oh yeah. Um, but there were things I didn't expect that really people might not be aware of that were really impactful to me even years later. An example would be I distinctly remember the week we had to train with OC spray, mace, whatever you want to call it, pepper spray. And you had to get sprayed, a direct hit. Then you had to turn and you had to fight with someone for 2 minutes. So they would have someone literally rolling with you and fighting with you. And you could not give up or walk away, or I mean, you could, but that would not go well. Right. So, and then after the 2 minute, which you're waiting, I distinctly remember my eyes burning and feeling like they're on fire and waiting for someone to call the 2 minutes as we're tossed, I'm getting tossed around, getting back up, trying to get hits in, taking hits. After the 2 minutes was up, you got kind of ripped over, slapped handcuffs on, and put in the back of a Cruiser. It was a car at the time. And the door shuts and you're waiting there just to see what it's like, how quickly you need help. You need, I don't want to call it, well, it would be medical aid, like if I had asthma, for example, but it was rough. And then they quickly take you out of the car and escort you over to the table with creamers, gallons of milk. Some guys were pouring the gallons over their heads. You put the creamer pods in your eyes and you get sprayed down, and milk is, it's like an antidote, not completely, but it takes away a lot of the hard sting. But the lesson was, which was really valuable to go through it, was how disempowering and terrifying it is, even just to be handcuffed. Like when you literally cannot get your arms and your hands in front of you and someone else has control of you, particularly if you're in pain. That was really impactful. And it demonstrated in a really powerful way how not to treat people and what it feels like, but also that you can still fight through pepper spray. You can still fight through being injured or feeling like I give up, I want to scream and run away from this, or you can fight through that. And it was beneficial to see for myself what I could fight through, so that you would know if I were alone on the street in a bad situation at all 5'2.5" of myself. And let's say I did try to deploy pepper spray and it was either unsuccessful or hit both of us, that's not the end. I'm still fighting and I can still fight. But also it really showed you that the bad guys can still fight. that pepper spray is not going to save you in a bad situation. And if you're punking someone off or quickly going to a use of force like that, relying on that to save your butt, you're going to be in a lot of trouble very quickly. So, yeah, that was really.
The handcuffing, when you mention it, it seems like I've been handcuffed quite a bit going back to when I was probably 14.
Yeah.
And every single time I've ever been handcuffed, I quickly become acutely aware of my being, when you mention it, it seems like I've been handcuffed quite a bit going back to when I was probably 14.
Yeah.
And every single time I've ever been handcuffed, I quickly become acutely aware of my face itching.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Because you can't, if I'm here talking to you, real quick like this, but you're handcuffed and immediately you become aware. Now, you mentioned the mace, and this is something I think a lot of people don't understand about mace. Most people think it's just it burns your eyes, but I've been around mace a lot because in prison they use it. Anytime there's a fight, they spray it. And even when you're at a distance, it makes it difficult to breathe.
Oh, yeah.
So when you're getting sprayed in the face, I can imagine like you're suffocating.
Not suffocating, but it has a direct impact on your breathing. And then you can have like a panic response, and then it actually exacerbates it. So, but it is really risky for people with conditions like asthma. or any kind of lung disease or lung impairment, it can be very dangerous. So yeah, it is no fun. I can remember a crazy incident in my jurisdiction. It was a holiday. People were lined up all the way down the street for a restaurant that was popular on holidays. Someone got angry in the line. I'm saying there were like probably 60 to 80 people in this line. Someone got mad. I'm not clear if they left and came back with it or had it, but they basically foghorned the group, the line, with like a bear spray size mace can. And I mean, it was like we had like a critical incident response. You had people dropping, you had people gasping for air, and it was, and then the hysteria of it's terrifying. But it was a large group of people that were maced at once. And it was terrible. Terrible.
Even as the person using it, right? So if you're trying to constrain or rather restrain a suspect and you spray them, just being in proximity, you're going to
get it. Yeah, you're going to get it for sure. Yeah, it taught me that I don't think I ever pepper sprayed someone in my entire career. I really
seems like you'd remember that.
I really didn't like it after that. We got tasers shortly after I graduated from the academy, and those were really, those were a game changer, because once civilians saw what they could do, mind you, excuse me, they're not perfect. But what they can do, it just was a game changer in terms of, excuse me, some scenes where someone who you'd previously fought with, if you got dispatched to the address, you knew this is going to be hands-on. They might send 3 cars. I can remember one household in particular where both brothers were advanced in martial arts and also quite violent.
I think I know who you're talking about.
No names mentioned.
They were both friends of mine.
Mine in high school. Once we got the tasers and people saw that laser light on them, a lot of people was just like, yeah, we're done. We don't want to fight. So it revolutionized some of those calls, because once you can you flip the switch on and you see that red laser dot, a lot of people didn't want to fight or go hands-on. We didn't have to fight or go hands-on. Nobody gets the pepper spray. And it really was quite effective. So, yeah, things like that at the academy were great. Marching us through a field and tear gassing us, I'm going to say, was not amazing or necessary. I suppose it demonstrated the same point, but that was awful. Tear gas is awful.
You just gave me a very interesting perspective, because it's often difficult to see how somebody else is seeing a situation. So the 2 brothers that you mentioned, no names, but I used to hang around with them all the time. And I, of course, knew that they had martial arts training, but it never, ever occurred to me as we're driving around, or whatever hell we're raising, drugs we're taking, drinking. It never occurs to me, wow, these 2 guys are both very trained in martial arts, because it wasn't relevant to me. So that didn't come into my perspective. I've been with them and gotten pulled over by the cops, and it's just, okay, you're getting pulled over by the cops, and you deal with the cops. It never came to me that as these cops are pulling us over, the police might view this as a dangerous situation.
Oh, for sure. And it's helpful, intel works in a lot of ways in law enforcement, formally and informally, but many, many times what would happen, if you would go to an address or you'd stop a car, you'd call out the location. When you run the op number through dispatch on the radio, everyone's listening. And then the dispatcher will come back and repeat the name. You read the op number and the name so that everyone knows who you have stopped. And not only guys working on the shift, but some guys off duty would have their radios on, and they would say codes that would indicate, they would either just say, use caution, that person can be an issue physically, or they would use a code that would indicate, can you get where they can't hear you so I can give you information about that person, to say, hey, they usually carry a 9mm, or hey, not only do they have martial arts training, they've been known to fight repeatedly. So particularly for rookies, that was important to give them that kind of information. But definitely, any call, in a town that, like the town that I worked for, with fewer than 40,000 people, dispatch intel is really helpful because you build intelligence based on names and addresses. So the dispatchers, let's say if they're sending you to a disorderly call to give an address that's been a problem in the past, they can say, hey, the last 3 times we've been there have resulted in custodial arrests, use caution. So-and-so has also likes to collect machetes. Use caution when go to the basement. That's where they keep their machetes. So,
Wow.
so that kind of stuff is very helpful.
Having this conversation, it just brought back a time when I was arrested and I was being followed by the police, and I had a 32 caliber automatic, or semi-automatic rather, pistol on me.
Yeah.
And when I saw the lights behind me, I reached in my waist and I grabbed the gun and I threw it under the seat to hide it. The police in the report, they thought that the gun was under the seat and I reached for it. And, when they pulled me over, I was in the passenger seat and I looked to my left and the cop had his weapon drawn on me, and another cop pulled me out of the passenger seat, threw me on the ground, and, he had his weapon drawn on me. Only years later, and when I reflected on it and thought about it, those cops would have been perfectly justified in blowing my brains out. Like, they wouldn't even, an investigation would have cleared them. They had a suspect with a fully loaded handgun reaching in the handgun's direction. Had they killed me, and that it kind of scares me even thinking about it now, because it didn't occur to me then, one, how dangerous the lifestyle I was living in terms of I could have ended up dead, but also the effect that would have had on a police officer, right? If that cop takes my life, I'm 20 years old, that stays with him forever.
Right.
So I'm putting myself in danger. I'm putting him in danger. And I just don't think, well, I know criminals don't consider that stuff. It's all about what I want, when I want it. There's no regard for anybody else. But I wonder, does that, when you're on the job, does that weigh on your mind that you might have to hurt somebody, perhaps even kill somebody?
Well, a couple things. I wouldn't say for me it weighed on my mind. I had an early incident, it's a longer story to tell for another time, but I was definitely naive and way too trusting early on in my police career. And as a result, I got, my face split open and attacked. And it was an early lesson for me just to see how quickly things can go south and how seriously injured you can get when you trust people and you're not careful. But in the moment, and on these calls, I don't recall, you can't, if you're the kind of person that hesitates or is really apprehensive, law enforcement is not a great place for you, because any form of hesitation in terms of tactical decisions really could end up getting yourself killed, someone else killed, innocent people killed. So you can't hesitate. You have to be able to make quick, good decisions. The other thing I would say is the general public has no idea, and it would frustrate me on the job. And it may be worthwhile in some way to make it more public. The frequency with which I would have been justified in using lethal force on a regular basis that was never used, there are no news stories on. And I can give you a quick example if we have time.
Sure.
I was a detective, plain clothes, in a car with another detective. And I believe we were going to grab coffee before we started our day. And we had a few, you see different officers on traffic posts at like construction sites. So there are a few officers at traffic posts in our town, as there often are. And the quick version is someone who disliked police and was under the influence of either drugs or alcohol drove by these officers and just decided, I'm going to F somebody up today. So she drove by them, swung around abruptly, got out of her car, and ran at two officers on this traffic detail with a knife in her hand. And one officer was in his cruiser and one officer was out of the cruiser. And it was terrifying to listen to. We were trying to get to them as you hear them calling it out, but we were on the other side of town. The officer who was outside the car, his hearing was obstructed by the construction. So in real time, you're listening to the other officer try to call out and tell him that she's coming at them with a knife. And obviously that officer exited his vehicle. And I mean, it was sickening to listen to, because especially when you can't, when you're physically not there yet, but you're listening to it and the stress in there. And you know, when you work with people for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, you know their voice. Police officers can read each other's voices in a way that it'd be hard to spell out. It's really incredible. You get to know what they sound like on routine stops, calls, higher stress, real stress. And this was very stressful. Anyway, by the time we get there, she's being taken into custody. She's been when he eventually ordered her to drop the knife, she didn't drop the knife. She actually threw the knife at his head. By the time I got there, I was asked to pat her down for weapons because she was already handcuffed. And she proceeds to kick me, spit in my eye, spit in my hair, break my glasses. And no one's assaulting this woman, and no one is harming this woman, and no one has shot her, and no one has tased her, and no one has maced her. This is just a morning as a cop, in a municipality. There were several moments where it would have been justified. Certainly the two officers on scene watching her run at them with the knife. She said something threatening. I don't remember specifically what it was, so I'm not going to quote it, but, and then assaulting me. And this was fresh COVID. These were like the early COVID months where you didn't know, there was no vaccine yet, like how serious it was. So for someone like this to spit in your eye and your hair during those early COVID times, that was a big deal. And she just actually doesn't even get taken to booking. She subsequently was transported to get some help because she was clearly having some type of a mental health breakdown, but no force used, no police story, no report, and it's too bad because, there are some very public, really unfortunate and also horrific, traumatic police-related incidents, such as the George Floyd murder. That's on one extreme. Over here, there are, at least in my area, I don't know what it's like to be a cop in Mississippi or other parts of the country, but in the Northeast, where we have a lot of training, high quality training, resources, the number of times stuff like that happens would shock you. And if the news came and did a story about that on the regular, people I think would see it differently. They don't probably have a good sense of how routinely things like that. Now that doesn't happen every morning, but there are incidents where certainly force would be justified and is not used whatsoever.
There was a shooting when I was I don't know, maybe 18 or 19 in town, where a guy charged the cop, and the guy had a bottle in his hand, and the cop shot him in his abdomen. And I remember watching it, I saw it on the news, and I thought, wow, that's ridiculous. It's so unjustified. And then I asked the cop about it. And he told me, he said, Michael, what if the cop doesn't shoot him? The guy hits the cop with the bottle, takes his gun, and now the cop is disarmed and this dangerous person has the weapon. And it's something that just never occurred to me that could happen. All I was thinking of in terms of how much could a guy do with a bottle? That's not, that's not deadly, whereas a gun is. It didn't occur to me that it can devolve into a deadly situation. And then I said, well, why do you have to shoot the guy in the stomach? And he told me, well, we're trained to hit this area because it's the largest area. So we're trained. That's what we're supposed to do. And it's an enlightening thing. It was even at that age, even when I was, knee deep in my own criminality, to understand that I don't understand. You know what I mean? There's a lot of things that I'm missing. But even with that, my perspective, and I'm curious to get your take on this. I've talked to cops who have told me, yeah, when they've actually engaged in police brutality. Like, for instance, a guy gives them a hard time, he's making them chase him through the streets and everything else. And finally you get him, you throw him down and you give him a few kicks. I get the human propensity and the human urge to want to make somebody like that pay. But in my view, if you're a police officer and you're supposed to be trained, you just can't do that kind of shit.
Right.
Like, people have to accept that, cops are touted as heroes often, but then you have to behave heroically. You have to control yourself in those situations. And if you can't, then maybe you should find another line of work. That's my take on it. How do you view those kinds of situations?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. And what you described, you were a kid in, I'm guessing, the early 80s, late 70s.
Wow, how old do you think I am? I said I was
70s?
19. No, I was 19. It was 95, maybe
Okay.
96.
Oh
my goodness.
I'm trying to understand the culture and the time when you saw police getting frustrated, then getting someone, and then having a couple of, I think you described it as a couple of extra kicks.
Yeah.
I literally never saw that in 20 years. It could be because of me. I don't know. I'm not always a toe the line person. I can be somewhat confrontational. So I don't know if that had an effect on it, but
yeah, maybe they're just not doing it in front of you.
That's right. That could be. Yeah. But I have a short fuse, not physically, but mentally. Like, I can get fired up pretty quickly. And that example with that woman that was threatened to stab my coworkers, ran at them with a knife, then threw a knife at one of their heads, then continued to verbally abuse and threaten us, spit in my eye and my hair, broke my glasses, kicked me. I was getting fired up, right? And now her stomach is near the hood of a vehicle. Now, my coworkers know me and they saw what was happening and what you do and what they did. My partner, it's like tapping out. He's like, let me take over, Al. And we switched out because I was getting really fired up at that point. So that's what you do. That's what good cops do. You watch out for each other. If someone is really taxing you, and you're getting your end with them, then you can switch off. And that works in interviews as well. When you're not getting anywhere in an interview with someone, there's no rapport, it's not going well, you're getting frustrated. A good coworker will step in and say, hey, why don't you take a break? And that's where you play the classic good cop, bad cop. They leave and then you say, he's kind of a douchebag anyway. He's always like that. And you build rapport and then you get further in the interview with them. Obviously that's just talk that you use and that's an interview tactic. But so I saw some people, not often, had that tendency where they had the inability to really rein in and control themselves in terms of physicality or use of force. And in an agency the size of the one that I was in, they were able to adequately see, monitor, and discipline and subsequently terminate people like that. I think that's probably not as easy to do in agencies with 600 officers, 3,000 officers. So
the title of the episode is Being a Female Cop. And I just have to wonder, what are the assets and what are the liabilities of being a woman working in this line of work?
Okay. Well, I guess I want to start by saying, contrary to what a lot of people think, for the most part, the guys were great to me, as was the agency. And I say the guys because for the majority of my career, my department is only about 50 staff, give or take a few. The majority of my career, there were only 3 females, sometimes 4 females. So we were always the minority. Now I think there may be as many as 7 or 8 there, which is great. But so which do you want me to address first, the liabilities or the assets?
Whatever you think is better.
I think that you could ask my former coworkers how I was a liability. I'm sure they would have some funny stories, but I'm still friends with a lot of the guys I retired with currently. So liability, I would say I'm not your best choice. I'm not your top pick. If there's a bar fight, and you've got 2 guys 6 feet or larger, out of control, am I your first draft pick? I probably shouldn't be, right? If you've got someone on PCP, which is a nightmare, when if anyone in your audience doesn't know, PCP impacts your pain receptors. So when you're under the influence of PCP, something like a taser is not going to comply you at all. You're not even registering those painful feelings that the average person would. So physically, to take someone, I can remember distinctly, we had a call near Burger King, for example, large male. Also, people tend to strip off their clothes when they're high on PCP, which is unhelpful for a lot of reasons, including the fact that they get overheated. That's why they take their clothes off. So they're sweaty. So you want to try to get under control a large, like 230-pound man, high on PCP, mostly naked and slippery. It's a nightmare. And that might take 4 or 5 guys. So I'm not, if this was the kickball team and that was your adversary, you're not picking me to be the captain of that team. Like, I'll go, but I'm not going to be your best, right?
See, I think most people, when they think female cops, maybe it's just my own male chauvinism, I don't know, but that's what comes to their mind when they think female cops. Liability, they're small, they don't have on average, they don't have the same muscle mass, the same height, the same speed. So they only think in terms of liabilities. And so I'm happy you got those out of the way first, because after, we met and we talked about you coming on the show, you enlightened me as to what would be the assets. And once you told me, it was like, oh yeah, of course. But before, it never occurred to me.
Yeah.
So what are the assets? How does it help to have women on the police force?
Okay. Well, think about the example that I used, Mike. How frequently have you seen a mostly naked, large, sweaty man on PCP running out of control is that not
more than I would have liked to?
on the outside.
Yeah, I don't know. On television, I've seen it, but no, I really haven't seen it in person.
What I'm saying is, those are the rare events. A massively violent bar fight that is just purely physical, that doesn't happen very often. The vast majority of calls for service involve arguments, disputes, crime complaints, theft complaints, motor vehicle accidents where people are fired up and upset and angry. So what kinds of skills do you need in those circumstances? Well, you better know how to talk to people, and you better be really good at it, right? You need to diffuse situations. You need to be able to relate to people, uh, being able to persuade people uh, to make better decisions when they're really hot. So I can remember many, many motor vehicle accidents. I mean, hundreds, where people are very angry and very upset and very heated. And I can remember a few of them in particular where they almost evolved into physical fights, so to be able to, in the moment, talk to people about, you don't want to do this. This is why. Come over here and talk to me. Distract, divide, separate. So in those situations, which are by and large the vast majority of calls, I think women actually do better. Their verbal skills are more developed, I would say. I don't know if you want to argue if that's biology or nature or nurture or what, but so verbal skills, your ability to talk to people, your ability to negotiate with people. So, I can remember being at scenes sometimes, one suicidal individual in particular, where a few of my coworkers got there first, and it was a concern. The guy had access to multiple knives. He was a veteran. And several of my coworkers who were there on scene before me thought the best move to stay safe was to point firearms at him, to say, don't, because they didn't want him grabbing. He wasn't actively moving at anyone. He was actually sitting in a bed. But, my approach was quite different, and my perspective on it was quite different, which I addressed with the boss on scene to say, hey, let me talk to this guy. Like, how are we going to get him the help he needs out of this bedroom, out of this apartment, down 2 flights of stairs into an ambulance? He really needed help. If we have multiple guns pointing at him, that's not really going to be. So, that's not without risk, right? So in that case in particular, tactically choosing to move in carefully, physically, without a gun drawn or a hand on a weapon to talk to him was a risk. I believe we had still one guy with a weapon trained on him, but certainly not a doorway full of weapons pointed at him, right? And I was able to successfully, after building rapport and listening to him and hearing him out and talking to him, literally walk him out of his bedroom, out of the building, and into the ambulance. And, I'm not saying that some of my male coworkers couldn't do that, but I think that I was really good in situations like that.
Empathy.
Women
tend to be more empathic. Yeah.
Verbal skills. And also, I don't really present the same threat that one of my coworkers would. So if someone is prone to, when they're feeling scared or having let's say a mental health crisis, if they're already prone to violence, if they grew up fighting and they're in a bad place, let's say they took some drugs, or they're drunk, or having a mental health crisis, if their default setting is violence, and 2 guys show up who are big, intimidating, 6'5", many of my coworkers were 6'3", 6'4", 6'5", guys, they immediately see that as, a threat, and it's on, and you can hear them. You want to fucking go, you want to, and there's yelling and there's cursing. And well, when I show up, people don't really, generally speaking, people don't really say that to me because I don't look threatening. That doesn't mean I couldn't be a threat, right? But I'm definitely not perceived as the same threat. And because of that, female officers, I don't know if I can say all female officers, but female officers tend to have that asset. Now, there may be some female officers who, don't fit that, but I'm saying generally speaking. And I can fit in small spaces. I can remember being lowered down into, we couldn't get into a house that we had to get into. We believed someone was in there having a literally like end of life crisis, and they were. They really needed, we didn't even know if they're still alive, and we couldn't get in, couldn't break through. It was like a reinforced steel front door, and I can remember getting lowered in through the basement window because I fit. And that guy was, he was on his last, it was a bad situation, and he needed to get help. I don't know how many more days he would have made it in the place he was in. So yeah, I would say the assets are, your verbal skills, the fact that the general effect you have on the people that you interact with isn't the same as for male officers. And also crime victims, some crime victims don't even want to talk to a male officer. So particularly if it's, domestic violence victims, not all domestic violence victims are female, but many of them are. And many of them only want to talk to a female investigator. The same goes for sexual assault victims. And I had male sexual assault victims that actually only preferred to and only wanted to talk to a female investigator. There was a strong preference I found for child victims of crimes. The parents preferred a female investigator. So you can't dial a cop, you can't like request, when you send the cop, I want this height, weight, hair color, but I'm just broadly speaking, there were some situations where it was advantageous.
Your last asset you mentioned actually provides a great segue into my last question, and also into what we'll be talking about the next time you come on. And that is, what is it that you're working on now?
So I retired. I spent a few months traveling and delicious meals and sleeping in and visiting friends and really having a blast. And then after a few months of that, you get back to, you want to do something meaningful. At least I do. So what I'm doing now is doing public speaking and educating, advising, consulting on issues related to preventing sexual harm, and also how not to become a crime victim. So I have a lot of information for people about ways that they routinely expose themselves to crime that they're unaware of. And examples would be senior citizens in your life that you care about, ways that they are at risk and put themselves at risk unknowingly. So I give workshops and presentations and talks to groups like that on how to better prepare to not become a crime victim. But in particular, I would say I'm most passionate about preventing sexual harm. It's probably what I have the most experience with and what I'm best at. So one of the things that was formative for me was monitoring the registered sex offenders in my jurisdiction for years. And you learn a lot about, there were things I learned doing that, things that I believed that were not true, and then things that I didn't realize that were true that were. So a real difference between what's on TV and Hollywood and what actually happens. And the thing I found, one of the things that was most significant was how predictive some of these sexual assault cases were. And if you could unpack them, once you did the first and the second and the fifth and the sixth, and you went on in your career and investigated these, many of them are, A plus B equals C. So if we could unpack that backwards and get to educating people about how not to even get there, that's what I'd like to do.
Awesome. All right, Alison, where can people find you? Is your website up and running?
It is. It's looking fancy. I'm happy with it. It's taken a lot of work. It's called Protect Us, is my business. Protect Us, one word. And I'm at protectus.solutions, no com at the end. And yeah, I've spoken for staff and students at Central Connecticut. I've spoken for smaller groups of people. I've done consulting for families, individual families with concerns. And one thing I didn't add in the work that I'm doing now, I did actually investigate a fair number of false accusation cases where men were falsely accused of sexual assault. And that is something that, even though the cases were subsequently dropped and were not pursued by the court, I saw the devastating impact those cases had on those men and their families. And I learned a lot about how young men in particular need to better prepare themselves to not get into bad situations. So that's something else that I do talk to families about and individuals about. So Protect Us, solutions. My name is Alison Sullivan, Alison with one L, Sullivan with two. And yeah, we'll talk again. This was fun.
Alison, thank you so much. And I cannot wait to have you back on.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you. For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Leibowitz. Till next time.